Hello. Buongiorno. Good. Hi, guys. Hello. Very good to see you. I see you've got a big number of people. I'm Frederick Ilchman, and I'm welcoming you to this portion of our education and enrichment series. We are got a great topic, probably the most important of all Venetian artists, and also a very good group of panelists, people who are deeply involved with this artist, Venetian painting more generally, etc. And all examples of what, say, Venice is doing to restore great masterpieces in one of the world's most lovely cities, but also share this information with broad audiences of all kinds: students, educated lay people, travelers to Venice, the Venetian public, museum goers, and much more. So today's presentation is called Titian and Say Venice, Conserving Six Masterpieces. And we have, so I'm the chairman of Say Venice. I'm also a museum curator here in Boston, at the Museum of Fine Arts. And I will, speaking to you from Boston, it'll be fun if you would able to put in the Q&A where you are listening to for this, where you are logging in. It's always a pleasant thing to see just how wide the reach is and what a Zoom can do with people in many places. So if you'd like to put that into the Q&A, I will be able to note many of those. And I see people Upper West Side, New York, Boston, Montreal, Canada, North Carolina, Newark, Connecticut, Larkspur, California, New York City, Houston, Washington, D.C., on and on and on. And that's really wonderful. The appeal of, say, Venice, and let's be honest, the appeal of Titian goes very far. I want to thank all of you for joining us today. You're going to not have your own faces on camera, but rather you will be able to do questions through the Q&A. And I know we're at many different time zones, and those of you who tell us where you are will see exactly how far this broadcast goes. And I'm also thanking our panelists, Davide Gasparotto and Gabriele Matino, who are the authors of the book that this presentation is celebrating, and Matthias Wivel, who is a museum curator now in Copenhagen in Denmark, though time before that in London, and then Cleo, Nisse. And in fact, I will just talk for a second about, say, Venice and this artist, and indeed how this, in some senses, how this book came to be. But Davide Gasparotto will talk more about this. So this is the cover of a book, Titian and Say Venice, Conserving Six Masterpieces. It will be out early in the new year, published by Marsiglia. And that's that wonderful detail of the member of the Pesaro family, the boy looking out at us, that sort of interlocutor. And look at those beautiful fabrics, those gorgeous cut velvets and satins, which Titian could paint better than anyone else. Next slide. So Say Venice didn't set out to do a book, right? What happened was that we are, of course, committed to restoring the most at-risk and most beautiful, most important works of art in Venice, in the Veneto. And over the last years, let's say last 15 or so, really built up a huge amount of momentum in Titian conservation. And now this is Giulio Bono, very accomplished conservator, working on perhaps the most famous of all Titian paintings. He's right up there, at the Virgin Mary on the mobile scaffolding of the Assunta. You see him right there. Incredible treatment that just finished a few years ago. Next slide. And so Titian himself, born 1488, around, dies in 1576, the most important Venetian artist on the world stage, who's the true rival, maybe superior in fame to Michelangelo. Their lives overlapped quite a bit and intersected. This is the famous self-portrait in Berlin, and you see someone whose eye is always moving, even though parts, particularly the left hand, are unfinished. Gorgeous sensitivity to fabrics as well, and the psychology of the sitter here, of painting himself. And we've realized that we've done so many Titian conservation projects over the years that, this might be one, because people involved in this organization and donors have really responded. And also a particular professor, right here, next slide, and that's David Rosand, who died in 2014. He was, among other things, my dissertation advisor, but a man of enormous learning who loved Titian so deeply. You see here him standing in front of, in the now Gallery dell'Accademia, the Sala dell'Albergo, the famous presentation of the Virgin. He is talking to a group of Save Venice supporters and members of the board, and they are. He was such a gifted public speaker, showing such energy and deep thought about this artist. Among the things that I remember gleaning about Titian was his sense of how the actual flat painting, the shapes on it, relate to the notions of depth, and how Titian, through his broad brushwork, his so-called pittura di macchia, or spotted brushstrokes, was able to convey wonderful worlds, not strong contours in the more Florentine sense, but using suggestion and sort of quivering patches of paint. He was so good at that. One of his other basic rules was our current reactions to a painting are a very good indication of how they would have been received hundreds of years ago, and even to some degree, the intentions of the painter. Like, the point is, David Rozan believed that you could recover the past to some degree, and we should not be timid in doing so. Another one of his things was to write beautifully, and he always said that description naturally leads into interpretation. When you talk about what you are seeing, you are making an interpretation. And then my favorite comment of his, when he was asked, how far should we, as a museum goer, stand from a work of art? He said, the length of an arm plus one brush, right? That you should be basically in the same distance that a painter was when it was being created in the first place. So David Rozan is a scholar who influenced so much the field of Italian Renaissance, particularly Venetian art, very much influenced the direction of Save Venice up until his death in 2014. And indeed, he continues to have great sway over our activities today. And in fact, the painting you see, the presentation of the Virgin, that major restoration, which kind of kicked off the last sort of 15 years or so of Save Venice's Titian conservation, that restoration was dedicated to David Rozan. Next slide. And then I want to also salute the very generous sponsor, Christopher Todd Page, looking very happy in front of a painting he sponsored in Treviso, the famous Annunciation, which is in the Duomo of Treviso. And so Christopher Todd Page paid for this beautiful restoration, and major things were discovered around this, including an inscription which had been covered for decades. But also, then he went further, and our sponsor here decided to donate the funds to make this book possible. So super exciting. Everything coming together, I think, and just I want to salute the generosity of our many donors. And so I'll just say quickly who our panelists are. Next slide. We're led by Davide Gasparotto, who is senior curator and head of the paintings department at the Getty. He's on the board of Save Venice, and he currently chairs the Educational Resources Committee, which is all about how fellowships, website, how we use how we deal with books, exhibitions, and think about sort of the broader transmission of our findings and our love and enthusiasm and knowledge about Venice. So he's in charge of that, and a distinguished career in Italy before coming to the Getty. The other person on that slide, Gabriele Matino, is senior researcher at Save Venice and works as an independent curator. He is, in effect, really our curator also and our editor in the Venice office. And those two people are the co-editors of this publication, Titian and Save Venice. And then also we have coming up after that, Matthias Wivel, who is head of research at the Carlsberg Glyptotek in Copenhagen, but was at the National Gallery in London before that. A number of very important exhibitions on 16th century Italian art, but also importantly has been engaged with Titian for a long time. And then finally, Dr. Cleo Nisse, assistant professor of early modern European art at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands, and she takes a particularly technical approach to this study of Venetian painting, and it's done groundbreaking work on the use of canvas supports and the way that Venice led other European centers to that. So we've got a great team of people to look forward to in the next sort of 40 minutes or so. Questions should go through the Q&A tab. Your microphones are not enabled, but put your questions or your comments there. I'm very grateful to have so many people checking in with us, and particularly the experts that you will hear from in just a moment. I also see Vicenza, San Diego, New York City, Pienza, and Middletown. So doing very well. Thank you, everyone. Davide, please.
Thank you very much, Frederick. Good morning or good afternoon or good evening, everyone, since we see that you are really tuning in from everywhere in the world. I'm very pleased to be here, and I have been working on this publication together with Gabriele Matino for the last couple of years. And it's a book that whose aim is sort of to highlight the conservation work that Save Venice promoted and sustained on 6 major paintings by Titian. We can go maybe to the next slide, that were conserved between 2010 and 2023. And in some way each one of them is a sort of an important milestone of Titian's like first half of Titian's career, because we arrive until the end of the 1530s, so then Titian will have still half of his career, but these paintings are really defining works of the first half of his career. The first one is, and the earliest of these paintings is the Paletta, the small altarpiece with St. Mark, today in sacristy of the Santa Maria della Salute, but originally from the Church of Santo Spirito in Isola, so a church that was demolished. A 16th century church that was demolished in the island of Santo Spirito, and which is a sort of when Titian confronts with the traditional Venetian Sacra Conversazione. Then we go to the Assumption, the Assunta, the most celebrated and glorious painting by Titian, really a defining work for the history of 16th century Venetian art, but also a key moment in Titian's career, because it's really the moment when Titian sort of, after painting the Assunta, becomes in some way the leader, the dominator of the Venetian artistic scene, and a work that, is in some ways as important as the great masterpieces, the Vault of the Sistine Chapel in Rome by Michelangelo, or the Stanze by Raphael, is the equivalent of the great works by Michelangelo and Raphael in Rome in its innovation, in its innovative aspect. And then we go to the Madonna di Capesar, which is in some way is Titian, not the confrontation of Titian, but the redefinition by Titian of the traditional Venetian Sacra Conversazione, with this completely new way of placing the figures, taking into account obviously the particular location of the altar within the Church of the Frari. So a key work. And then we go on into the next slide, where we see the other 3 works, which are the Treviso Annunciation, a work that sometimes is a little bit on the side of Titian's literature, but it's which is very important. We rediscover the date 1520, and also the inscription that refers to the patron of the work, which is portrayed in the back, the canon Brocardo Malchiostro, and an important work by Titian in the terraferma that was really dirty and in bad condition. So the conservation treatment was really very important to restore the Titian's original palette. And then the presentation of the Virgin in the temple, today in the Galleria dell'Accademia, but still in its original location, in the Sala dell'Albergo of the Scuola Grande della Carità, which is when Titian really confronts himself with the tradition of the Venetian telero, with all the, characteristic of the Venetian telero, but also with the innovation that Titian imports into this tradition. And then last, the Annunciation from the Scuola Grande di San Rocco in Venice, which is a painting that has been discussed a lot in Titian literature, especially about its chronology. And with our intervention, I think we have been able to understand much better the genesis and the subsequent history of this painting, a painting that was probably painted by Titian in two moments, in two different moments, probably at the beginning in the early 1520s, and then reshaped, reworked extensively with a different sort of style in the late 1530s. In some way, our book highlights I would say, the philosophy of conservation adopted by Save Venice, because each intervention on an artwork that we promote includes not only the proper conservation treatment, but always an array of archival and technical investigations that help to inform the choices of the treatment itself. For example, when we restore a painting, it is crucial, it's very important to gather information on previous restorations. And in Venice, we are particularly lucky because past conservators, they have been good, even in the 19th century, even in the end of the 18th century, to leave to us documents about what they have done on the paintings. But also our research and the technical investigation contribute in some way to expand our knowledge of a given artist painting technique, workshop practice, in this case about Titian. And so I always say that maybe that our motto could be conservation produces new knowledge. And the aim of this book is to, convey in a proper way this new knowledge that we have gathered over the course of these 6 important conservation treatments. In the last 30 years, as you know, the contribution of technical art history has been of really paramount importance for a true redefinition of the discipline and for a new understanding of painters' techniques, artistic processes, workshop practices of medieval and early modern artists like Titian. And it is called the so-called material turn in art history that played really an important role in the conception of this volume. And if we go to the next slide, we can see that in some way this is reflected in the structure that we gave to the book itself. The book is preceded by 2 introductions. One introduction that Gabriele and I wrote together about the relationship of Save Venice with Titian. And so a little bit of history of Save Venice, a history of how these interventions came to be. And then a more art historical overview, which was written by Enrico Maria dal Pozzolo, a distinguished Italian scholar of Venetian 16th century painting, which is about this moment, this important phase of Titian's career. But then these 2 introductions are followed by sort of 6 chapters or diptychs, as we call them, which are about the individual artworks, where in some way the voice of the art historian is paired with the voice of the conservator. In the case of the Assumption, many conservators, because there was the conservation not only of the painting, but also of the wooden support, the stone altar. So there are more, it's a more complex treatment. So from these diptychs, you will be able to gather knowledge about, Titian's patrons, the chronology of his paintings, the iconography, but also about Titian's artistic process and the history of conservation of this painting, which sometimes is very crucial to understand how in which condition they arrived, they came down to us. And we can see here that this is reflected also, this dual nature is reflected in the design of the book, where in some way the more art historical, more traditional chapter is printed on white paper, and the technical essays are in this light gray, printed on this light gray paper. And so there is a difference in layout, but it's a very rich book in terms of both the art historical and the technical information. And I would conclude saying that the other crucial component of the book is represented by the illustrations, because we wanted to make the book full, obviously, of new content and new information, but we wanted also the reader to get a sense really of the astonishing beauty of these paintings and feel almost immersed in Titian's miraculous brushwork. So each chapter is accompanied by a suite of generous illustration of, especially of details of each painting, which, as you can see, if we go to the next one, which, as you can see, sometimes they take almost an abstract quality. On the left, for example, here you see is one of the wings of one of the little angels, cherubs in the Assumption. And then this is the foot of the Virgin in the Assumption, also with a portion of the drapery. So we really wanted our readers to get a sense of how incredible is Titian's approach to painting, how modern, how, you know, really sometimes these look like abstract paintings. And in some way, especially in the Assunta, we sort of see encapsulated in some way the entire trajectory of Titian's artistic career, where we see portions which are painted, you know, very beautifully detailed, but some other which are really painted with this sort of pittura di macchia, this very almost abstract brushwork. And with that, I will let the floor to Gabriele to say a few more words about the book, and then our two guests, they will delve more into the content. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you, Davide. Thank you, everyone, for attending this book presentation. My very short contribution to describing the structure of the book will focus, as you can see here on the slide, on Titian and St. Venice conservation timeline. What you see are two screenshots from the actual book, and this timeline is physically located at the very end of the book, but nonetheless is very important. What it does is to list chronologically all the different projects, completed projects, sponsored by St. Venice over almost 50 years, from 1978 up to 2024, so all the completed project. What it shows, I think, is, first of all, St. Venice's long-standing commitment to Titian's legacy. And it also shows the continuity of donors' engagement, which makes conservation treatment at St. Venice something like a collective achievement. So these projects that were done by St. Venice actually were done because of the generous support of all our donors. And that's the reason why in all the different paintings that you see listed here, there will be details giving you information about the title of the painting, the dating, the date, of course, of the conservation treatment, but also all the different names of our generous sponsors. There is another thing that you can infer from the timeline, which I think is important, and it has to do, first of all, with the quality of the works of art that St. Venice restored, but also, and this is important, the variety of the different works of art produced by Titian within a larger production and then restored by St. Venice. Next, please. So when you think about Titian, the first thing that comes out to your mind, of course, is the Assunta. You all recognize the painting. Davide just introduced it. It is the high altar in the Basilica dei Frari in Venice. And well, it took an organization as ambitious as well as reliable as St. Venice to embark in such a, I would say, daring project, because after all, this is one of the largest painting on panel ever made. So it was a kind of a complicated project, and nonetheless, of course, St. Venice was able to complete it successfully. For all of those of you who were able to see the painting restored and going to the Frari, I mean, it's a feast of the eyes. It's an incredible result. Next. But then St. Venice not only focused on major masterpieces, also focused on less known paintings, at least among the general public. This is a great example, is the St. Nicholas altarpiece painted for the Crasso altar in our beloved church of San Sebastiano. Now, every time we go to San Sebastiano, we go there to admire Veronese's work. Nonetheless, this is the first painting that welcomes you once you enter the church, and it is quite a remarkable surviving example of the late Titian in Venice with the characteristic non finito, Frederick mentioned it before, and so with these really quick and energetic brush strokes that are so peculiar of the late Titian. So as I said, very known paintings, less known paintings, but also, next please, works of art on different media. This is quite a remarkable monumental and that really refined woodcut, which was produced after a design by Titian representing the Summation of the Pharaohs. Now, this work of art shed lights on the variety exactly of the production within Titian workshop, because there would be major altarpieces, devotional paintings, portraits, but also the master focusing on drawings and design, which is something quite interesting. And as we talk about the workshop, next one, please. This is really the last painting that I mentioned. Is an interesting Madonna and Child with Angel, one of the latest projects of by St. Venice. And it was indeed painted by Titian, but not Titian alone. This was painted together with his youngest brother, Francesco Vecellio. What is interesting is that this was made at the very beginning of Titian's career, when Titian and Francesco were partnered, working together in the same workshop in Venice, producing this very painting for the mainland. This painting, in fact, was made in Venice, but then sent to Sedico, small town nearby Belluno, on the way up to the Dolomites and Pieve di Cadore, where, you know, Titian and Francesco Vecellio, his brother, were born. And it's a painting, though, that it stresses the strong bond between Venice and the mainland. Titian workshop and the Venetian mainland, in a way, you know, among different reasons, shows you why St. Venice, of course, focus its efforts in Venice, but also sometimes goes to the mainland to restore some works. Next. So to conclude, I promise almost done. Two key points that I want to make. First one, of course, is conservation. Over the years, all these projects made all these paintings available for next generation to appreciate, to look at them, and to learn more. Learning was already mentioned by Davide, which is a crucial, and in fact is the next key point. What we do at St. Veni is to put together art historians and conservators to discuss, to create a dialogue, and eventually to produce new knowledge. And that knowledge is disseminated through sometimes exhibitions, many other times conferences, essays, papers, and books. And that's the reason we are here today. We're presenting a book focusing on 6 major paintings by Titian, restored by St. Venice, where once again art historians and conservators discuss in order to produce new knowledge. So it is now time for me, with a great honor and also a lot of expectation, to turn the floor to the next speaker, who is Matthias Wivel.
You didn't hear any of that, did you? Sorry. Anyway, thank you again. I was muted. Thank you, Gabriele. Thank you, Davide. Thank you, Frederick. It's a privilege to be here. Long-term admirer of the work done by St. Venice, and indeed of David Rosand, who also taught me at one point. So it's really a pleasure to be here and to talk about Titian. I will try to, like, based on the 6 works that we've just like the 6 restored works that are the feature of the book and that we've just heard about, I will try to make some points about Titian's career, some interpretive points. So in a way to give you a sense of his development, of his thematic and aesthetic concerns, and something about the individual works as well and his relations to other artists. It will be sort of a semi-biographical, certainly chronological presentation. What I normally tell people when I introduce Titian, what is so important about him? I think you can be one of the really important things about him that is a good way of summing him up in terms of his influence, at least, if nothing else, is that he is the painter most responsible for creating the notion in us of painting as personal expression. His touch, his expressive touch, his gestural paintwork, brushwork, carries with it the awareness in the viewer that it is created by a person with a specific sensibility. And he really brings that into painting. It's not like it didn't exist before, but he really brings it into the conversation at a time when the notion of the artist is changing from like that of a craftsman to what we understand as an artist, somebody who expresses something specifically personal to them. And so he's very, it's like, it's something that happens in this period. It's not Titian alone, but he's really important in that respect. And important to that is his approach to color and brushwork, the way he makes it sensual, the way he engages us as viewers, and the way we experience his paintings differently depending on where we see them from. So I will try to, if we can get the next slide. So we start with the earliest of the restored works, the St. Mark altarpiece in the Salute, of which we know very little about the commission. I'm not going to get too much into the details about commission and so on, but we know very little. But what we know about it is that this is an altarpiece that relates to the plague that was in Venice in 1509, 1510. All the saints you see here, Cosmas and Damien on the left, Roch and Sebastian on the right, are plague saints. They are invoked in times of plague to help people. And then St. Mark, of course, is emblematic of Venice, the patron saint. And this is a really striking device. His head is in shadow. The sun is coming in and like hitting the beautiful body of Sebastian, but the head of Mark is in shadow. And whether that is the shadow of the plague or however you want to interpret it, but it's a really striking thing. It could also be the shadow lifting, because this painting is there is a little bit of disagreement over the date, and you'll see here I've dated a bit later than it is in the book. It's an interesting discussion in itself that I won't get into here. But it could post-date the actual plague years. Anyway, what is special here, and it's a really radical work at the time. Titian has already arrived at something very special to him. These saints are depicted with a real sense of physicality, of presence, of naturalism, if you will. Whereas the painting as a whole, and this goes back to what Frederick was saying about David Rosan, this idea of the relationship, which is basic to paintings, the relationship between the surface and the sense of depth. And here you have a very innovative way a very graphic way of laying out the different areas of color. The clouds fleeting across the sky, of course the red and blue of St. Mark, the green cloth of honor on his throne there, also that he's placed so high. It's quite sort of striking against the sky. His placement against the sky, the dark face against the bright sky, and then the columns on the right that are sort of it's a symmetrical arrangement, but the columns creates a tension that is asymmetrical, and that's very Venetian. We'll get into that. Can we have the next one, just as an example of getting close to, we'll get to it in a minute. This one is important. So how did he arrive at this? The idea is, how did Titian arrive at this altarpiece? So we go back to the beginning, and we hear about Titian. I'm going to talk mostly about monumental works, big storytelling works, and less about portraits, which is one of his main occupations as a painter. He does one of the greatest portraits of ever, basically. But anyway, this is the earliest really large painting that we have by him. The Flight into Egypt. You can see it's slightly stilted in the figure, the way the figure drawing, but you see this brightness of color is already there. And this is a few years before, depending on when you date the St. Mark. This is a few years before, and it has this very lush description of the landscape, the sort of Venetian mainland, the terraferma, with the light filtering through the clouds. And this is often associated with, if we go to the next slide, his relationship with the great Giovanni Bellini, who was of the previous generation, the major Venetian artist of the time, and indeed at this time was regarded as the elder statesman of Venetian painting, the best painter in Venice, as Albrecht Dürer wrote back when he visited Venice in the early 1500s. And you can see here, the approach is quite different in many ways. I mean, this is a remarkable Death of St. Peter Martyr from the National Gallery, recently restored. It's a complete wreck, but it's very beautifully restored. And what that painting really, like the restoration really brought out, is Bellini's incredible sensitivity to light and movement, almost impressionistic way he paints those trees with the light filtering through it, the light filtering through also the trunks of the trees you see there in the back, and the sense of movement in the trees, that there's a blur in the canopies of the trees. And Titian, and this becomes like this is around the same time. This is like the Bellini's a little bit before the Titian. This was late Bellini. But this device of the screen of the screen of trees is something that Titian picks up, and that becomes a trope in Venetian painting. So Titian learns from Bellini, and he himself, through his ghostwriter or friend Ludovico Dolce, who writes his biography in the 1550s, he does note that he oriented himself towards Bellini, and he's often described as a pupil of Bellini, which is probably not the case. But let's get to the next slide, just to see the difference. These are not that many years apart. This is one of Bellini's greatest altarpieces, also late, the San Zaccaria altarpiece, where you have a presentation of the Virgin and Child with saints suffused with light. It's almost like he does the opposite of what Leonardo does, Leonardo da Vinci, where people disappear into shadow. In Bellini, especially late Bellini, they disappear into the light. You feel the sunlight in this painting. With Titian, there's a much more physical presence, like a stronger physical sort of bodily presence in it. It's not as elevated in a way. It's more down to earth, even though it is also monumental in all these things. And the level of abstraction is higher. There's less detail. There's larger, bolder areas of color. So there's a big difference here. And that difference, what accounts for that? Because, I mean, if he's a pupil of Bellini's, he himself sort of he says he orients himself towards him, and he's often regarded, but it's very difficult to find any early Titian in late Bellini, to find what he would have done there. They are very different artists, but it's clear that he learns a lot from Bellini and admires him. Let's go to the next one. Here, it's just to show you this presence. And the two saints, Cosmas and Damien, on the left there, you can see that they're probably portraits of real people. It feels very real, because he brings probably people associated with the commission. But that, combined with that sort of sense of abstraction and graphic effect, is important. Let's go to the next slide. One thing that I wanted to point to, and that helped me think about this, is that on the left you see a detail of the incredible. Titian is fantastic with white, not least in his early years. The variations of white and how he employs. He puts more white into. I mean, that I think he picks up from Bellini, putting a lot of white into the paintings, which is not necessarily common. But that you see that loincloth there, or the shroud, or like whatever it is around Sebastian. You see that also in this Risen Christ, which is a recent, well, fairly recent, it's like 10 years, 12 years ago. Discovery came out of nowhere, it seemed. It was in a private collection. It has gone back into a private collection. And it's around the same time, I think. And this picture, seeing this picture, which was only exhibited very briefly at LACMA back in 2014, but seeing it in the flesh, you realize how boldly painted it is. How like already at this early stage in his career, Titian is making gestural marks on the surface. It's almost, I mean, it's very rough. It's quite shocking when you get close to it. You can't really see it here in the reproduction, but it is quite shocking when you get to it. And that is not Bellini. And Bellini is not something who does that. So where does that come from? So let's get to the next one. So the Flight into Egypt is painted probably for Andrea di Loredan, and it is in his palace which is now the Palazzo Vendremi in Calergi, where the casino of Venice is. But it is in that palace from a very early date. Also in the palace is Sebastiano del Piombo's Judgment of Solomon. As you see, an unfinished picture. Like they're both very large, and they're both in that. In the palace, and Sebastiano is slightly older than Titian, his older colleague, friend, also said to be a pupil of Bellini, very innovative at this point, and somebody who leads the way, and Titian picks things up from him. But those two paintings, and you can see there's a Judgment of Solomon you have down there. You see the king sitting on a throne, very much like St. Mark. It's as if St. Mark is reflecting upon this very important painting, even though it was unfinished. It's surely a painting that a lot of people looked at. And on the facade of the palazzo, and in the same ambit, was Giorgione, who was, of course, somewhat older, about 10 years older than Titian. And he painted frescoes on the facade. It's a little unclear exactly. The documentation is a little unclear, but that is a reproduction of one of his lost frescoes from the facade of the palace, the Diligenza that you see on the right. Giorgione working in a fairly monumental format in fresco. And this is important because, if you go to the next one. Oh, sorry, this, I just needed to throw this in there because this picture is somehow connected to this whole, Sebastiano, Titian, and Giorgione in the employ of Loredan. This picture is set to be Titian's portrait of Giovanni Bellini, and it does very much look like Bellini, but there are various doubts that I won't get into here. The reason I'm throwing it in is because it's owned by the museum I currently work for, and it is in Copenhagen. But there's a portrait under it where he's wearing, technical examination shows he's wearing red, and he's a senator, so it's probably a senator, because that's what the senators would wear, red. He's clearly a Venetian nobleman, and it might be, at least in the first instance, might have been Andrea di Loredan, who the patron who was representative of the Venetian state and who probably brought Giorgione, Sebastiano, Titian together, or at least created some kind of dynamic between them because they're all working in the same palazzo. Anyway, we go to the next slide. Over on the left here, you see this nice view of Venice from the 18th century. Over on the left, you see the Fondaco de Tedeschi, which has recently been reconstructed in this time we are talking about, in the first decade of, it had burned down and been reconstructed in the first decade of the 16th century. And Giorgione obtained the commission to fresco the facade. And you can see in this picture here, the remains in the 18th century of his fresco facade, which would have been very impressive, but disappeared because of the climate of Venice. Frescoes don't really last there, even though it was a very frescoed city, even though they didn't last. And Titian, probably through Giorgione, and he describes that, also Dolce describes that in his biography of him, that Titian oriented himself, went from Bellini to Giorgione. And I think Titian is described as Titian fresco. If we go to the next one, we see the remains of the frescoes they did. On the upper right is Titian's Judith or Justice menacing what some see as a German soldier with the head of Holofernes at her foot. It's very this is like a fresco that's been detached from the facade of the palace and is in a ruinous state. And we have Zanetti's engravings. And same with the Giorgione over on the left, the nude woman there. It's also taken from the facade facing the Canal Grande. But I think this is crucial. It is often it's described in the sources that Titian had his own facade to paint, and people mistook it for Giorgione's work and thought it was better, and then Giorgione got jealous and so on. Vasari also relays this in his biography of Titian, which is reliant in some parts on Dolce's. And I think the truth is more complex than that they just were assigned two different sides of it. I think Titian really, where he must have worked with Giorgione on fresco, because I think the key to understanding his oil paint is understanding that he trained very early on as a fresco artist. Fresco is painted in wet plaster that dries very quickly. So you have to act quickly. You have to plan out your work to an extent, but you also have to act quickly and paint very boldly because it also has to be seen from far away. And I think Titian picks this up and applies it to his oil painting. If we just go to the next one, because the first documented work of Titian are the frescoes in Padua and the Scuola del Santo, painted in 1511, so after the Fondaco, where he painted a whole facade. He really painted a lot of fresco. He learned, this major work at this point is clearly the facade of the Fondaco, and then he goes on to paint this on the strength probably of that work, which he finished in 1510. He goes to Padua to paint this, and these are marvelous paintings. They're describing three miracles wrought by Saint Anthony of Padua. I won't get into the details, but they're very important for the development of Titian's narrative painting. But what I'm talking about here is technique. These are the three, it's a whole room. Yeah, here we get close to them. So here you see up close his technique, how bold they are, how expressive the brushwork here, the greasy hair of the jealous husband stabbing his wife, who's innocent of the things that he believes she's done. And also on the right, the women grieving this, the dead young boy here, or sick, dying young boy that St. Anthony revives. It's a very stark painting. Another important thing now, the the slide change is accelerating my voice and presentation, but that's good. The thing I also want to, so this is very expressive painting. And I think this is where his expressive gestural oil painting comes from. It does not come from Bellini. It comes from Giorgione and from painting. So I think actually we have to understand him as a disciple of Giorgione more than there's been a tendency to try to distance the two. On the left, you see the woman on the ground there, like a very impressive foreshortening of the body, the placement of the body. And it derives, I think, undoubtedly from Michelangelo's Eve on the Sistine ceiling in Rome, which Titian would not have seen, and which was actually hadn't even been unveiled by the time that Titian painted the woman and the jealous husband here, and which shows how attentive he was to what was happening elsewhere, and like the artists with which he wanted to compare himself, including Michelangelo, the other really famous artist at this point. And it just shows like how his intelligence. I mean, he had friends, colleagues in Rome. Sebastiano had gone there, for example. Oh, went there. Like Sebastiano went there, but he had others. Sebastiano not gone yet. He went in 1511. But he had other colleagues there, and that feeds into the Assunta, which we heard about here. What is remarkable? I mean, there's so many things remarkable about this painting, but in terms of Titian's development, in terms of this integration of naturalism and graphics, like layout, the sense of design, is this like it's divided into three tiers with the apostles at the bottom, with the cloud cover of angels, with the Virgin standing on in the middle, and God the Father at the top. It's also like a circle at the top, on top of a square at the bottom. It's a very geometrically organized, with the colors uniting also the two red apostles, sort of forming a triangle going through the Virgin into the red mantle of God the Father, and with the face of the Virgin in the center of the circle, described by the arch. It's a very carefully planned painting. And we always hear about like the traditional understanding of Titian's painting is that that he improvised a lot. And Cleo, but I'm really looking forward to, is going to go into the underdrawing, which is very interesting. But he must have planned this out very carefully, because it's such a finely wrought design. So he didn't just improvise. I mean, obviously you don't improvise a 7-meter tall altarpiece, but it's become the cliche about Titian that he did not draw, and it goes back to the 16th century that he did not draw and he improvised everything. It's much more complicated. He did draw a lot. I don't want to get into that now. Anyway, so this is just to show that like it is related to Central Italian developments. On the left, we have Michelangelo's early drawing for the Julius II monument. It's from, he initially got the commission from Julius II in 1505. It's an early project for it. It's a detail where you see that the monumental Virgin holding the child, which also appears so Raphael adapts in his Sistine Madonna very famously. Whether Titian knew these, I don't know, but he seems to have been somewhat aware of Raphael and Michelangelo doing these things. The resurrection of Christ, it's not quite clear what it's made for. By Raphael, this is the project. He never painted it, but you see the figure of Christ soaring above the tomb there is very close to the Virgin. The concept of it, at least, is very close. And I think Titian must have been, and Dolce describes that, informed by Titian in the 1550s, that people said that the Assunta had the grace and beauty of Raphael and the awesomeness of Michelangelo and the color of nature. So this is really Titian comparing himself with these artists and being associated with them, probably looking at what they were doing. And interestingly, Raphael's famous Transfiguration in Rome, which he paints as his last large painting, he dies just after he's finished it, or about the time he's finished it. It seems very closely related to the Assunta. We went on to the I'm sorry, it's changing very quickly here. The Transfiguration here is the same basic structure, the idea of having two levels. And Raphael must have, I mean, I think it just seems like Raphael must have been aware of what Titian was doing too. Raphael was always very aware of what his competitors were doing. And it's a painting painted after Titian's. And it's just, the influence went the other way too, and he must have been aware of it, even though he didn't go to Venice at this point. And the possible link is what we get in the next slide, which is Sebastiano del Piombo's decoration of the Borgherini Chapel. Sebastiano del Piombo, whom we remember did the Judgment of Solomon, friend of Titian, went to Rome in 1511 and stayed the rest of his career in Rome, leaving the field open to Titian in Venice. But they might have stayed in touch, and Sebastiano was working on Transfiguration, that Raphael, in competition with Raphael at this point, at the same point that they're developing these compositions. And it might be that Sebastiano has informed Titian, who knows? but there's an awareness of what's going on, like almost from week to week between Rome and Venice. It's fascinating. So that may be what's happening there. Let's go to the next one. Yeah. So what I want to just to say about the intensity of color and the depth of color, his ability to lend to his colored surfaces this texture and sense of that it's not just one color, that it changes with the light, and you get a sense of just that it's deep, it's not flat. And the way that she merges with the light here, for example, that strong sort of shape of her head against the almost abstract the light that sort of emerges from which the angels also take flesh in a way from the light. They come out of the light. So, and that's an important device that that Raphael explored before in his. We saw the Sistine Madonna earlier. That like this thing of angels and angelic choir finding its shape. And we'll return to that at the end of my talk. But here, it's just to show what he's doing at the same time, because he's not just doing this on time. I mean, he paints this astonishing altarpiece for, which is in Ancona, and you see it has the same richness of surface, this like really rich depth of color. He does this large altarpiece with Venetian skyline in the background. He does the next one that we're looking at here. We should do the next one. They have all polyptych, different format, different type of commission for Brescia. Where he has to do it's more sort of retrograde, multiple panels, and where he's really looking at classical sculpture. You see the echo of the Laocoon in the depiction of the risen Christ. A risen Christ is sort of a relative of the earlier one that we looked at. And from Michelangelo, this is a Michelangelo drawing for the Julius tomb that Titian must have seen something. I mean, it's so close for that remarkable Saint Sebastian. It was very Michelangelo-esque. So he's getting into this monumentality of form while still applying his own interpretation of like flesh and like the sensuality of the surface. Then we get to the Annunciation, which is slightly sort of maybe underrated painting. It's Titian really trying something. You see here, while the others seem like clearly sort of he's really like hitting for the bleachers and the others, but here he's trying to give depth. He provides depth of field where the angel is coming out towards the Virgin in this painting and painting at the same time. Very different in concept. He's trying to break with the idea of symmetry, which we had in the Assunta and in the St. Mark. And in part, it is by like taking the architecture and putting it off to one side, and then having the diagonals running off perspectively. But there's something about he has trouble placing the figures in a little like they're sort of stuck in there. He's struggling with placing them, and the donor in the background is like slightly out of scale. But what he's doing is relating to something that has been happening in Venice for a while. We see Cima da Conegliano, one of his predecessors, doing a sideway look at a Virgin and Child with saints. We see Sebastiano doing it in the San Giovanni Crisostomo altarpiece, same idea, and he's working with this. He's working with this concept of how can I, and it's a Venetian idea. This like to not have symmetry. And this is just it's like an astonishingly creative period in his life. He's paints all these big paintings, including and also small ones, portraits and everything. And what he also paints in this period is one of the next slide, these mythological pictures for Alfonso d'Este in Ferrara for a private chamber where he does mythological subject matter. We've been looking mostly at religious subject matter, but here we have mythological subject matter, stories from antiquity, from classical poetry. And here you have decentered compositions. And this is very Venetian to have it. The one on the left, which is the first one, he also tries to provide depth of field, but he sort of leaves that a bit and goes towards these more frieze-like arrangements that characterize most of his work through his career. You have those on the two on the right. That is sort of the chronology of them. Very rich in surface, very innovative, and obviously, very famous paintings. But it's just to show this is a painting where a period where he does all of these things. Incredibly like fertile phase of his career, and it culminates in some ways in the Madonna di Carpesaro, which I don't want to go into too much. I think Cleo will talk about it more, but the astonishing device against, and you'll see that in the book, how he develops towards this. I mean, again, we have this decentralized structure where you see the Virgin diagonally from the side, and then you have these columns put in there that he puts in towards the end, a really radical decision. Then we have the 30s. And in the 30s, most of his major works are lost. Incredibly important monumental pieces of work that we have here. it's a very dramatic, like heroic sort of action-packed paintings, all lost. So the one great painting we have from the period is the one that the next one, the presentation of the Virgin in the Temple, which seems very retro in respect, and it has that. And I again return to this idea of the Venetian paintings of having a frieze-like structure in the foreground where things are happening. This painting is indeed, because it's made for a scuola, one of these philanthropic institutions in Venice, for their chapter halls, where they would have these big paintings that were generally arranged like this. And it's related to, for example, Carpaccio, who did, of the previous generation, who did these kinds of paintings better than almost anybody else, with great narrative progression. And this is what Titian is giving his twist on, in a way, at a time when painting has moved on in many ways, at least if you're looking at what we would call the avant-garde now, and what Titian himself is doing. And so what he's doing, and what I think is very important that people overlook with this painting, and that my other teacher, Paul Giannidis, has pointed out, is that within this narrative of the Virgin being presented in the temple, going up the stairs herself with the light around her to meet the high priest up at the top of the stairs, is what is happening with all the people at the foot of the stairs. The people at the foot of the stairs, there are some portraits of Venetian officials, whatever, that were involved probably in but this is the important bit. Can we just linger with this? There are two more modestly dressed people in the crowd. One has his back turned, the other is quite old, and the man is touching the shoulder of the woman. These are, of course, Joachim and Anne, the parents, the old parents of the Virgin, seeing their little girl going off on her own. And you see how touched they are, like the connection between them, and they seeing their little girl going up the stairs. This is classic Titian. I mean, he finds the human story in his compositions. And this is like, it becomes incredibly moving once you notice it. And it's just there, it's underplayed. These are not the first people you'll see when you look at the crowd of people there, but they're there and they're reacting, and their emotions are apparent once you start empathizing with them. It's wonderful. Okay, next one. So this one, I find this very interesting in the book, that this painting might actually, which is, I think, when you look at the surface of this, 1540s. Titian in the 1540s, it looks like that. So we're moving into the second half of his career, very long career. I mean, he dies in 1576 and has a fantastic, glorious career after this. The 1540s is this like period of retrenchment for him, where he doesn't really innovate quite as much in his big narrative paintings. But it's interesting that this might originate earlier, that the technical evidence shows that. And if you go to the next slide, you see here, if we assume that this is correct, that the composition is developed in around 1520, it is in great dialogue with the Treviso Annunciation, and indeed with the Murano Annunciation, which was burned later in the century, the one on the right, which was sent to Charles V and was destroyed, which is sort of more successful realization of the same idea. But you suddenly see that that he's working out something here where he's trying to make this asymmetrical, like the symmetry and asymmetry, having those things work together and placing the figures in space, and then having a narrative that works. And I just think this is interesting to try to understand his creative process in the early 1520s, in this incredibly fertile period for him, that he's developing these ideas. And it ends up, the painting on the right is from the 1530s, early 1530s. And that culminates, and so I'm not going to talk about most of Titian's later career, but this is a later iteration of that same idea from the early 1560s. This is late Titian, the glorious sort of like magical impressionism, as Roberto Longhi called it, of Titian's open brushwork, the glow of the color, and this idea of a divine eruption of light coming down, just like in the Assunta in a way, but much more sort of wildly here. This is the moment of the conception of Christ. The angel is telling the Virgin that she's pregnant with the Son of God. And this is the moment that like she becomes pregnant in a way. It has that flash of, you can interpret it erotically if you want. You can also not do that spiritually for certain. But it has that richness of surface, and all this is incipient in the early. I mean, he's a very consistent painter, even though he develops a lot. And I think it all goes back to what I was talking about at the beginning, the gestural brushwork he learned as a fresco artist. I'll stop here. Thank you. Thank you for your patience.
Okay, thank you. I will jump right in. Thank you so much, Matthias, for that fantastic presentation, giving us a real sense of the sweep of Titian's activities during it's amazing what a fertile and productive artist he was, just how much he was doing. Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. Oh, no, can you just go back to that slide for us? Yeah, we'll just stay on this slide for 1 minute because I just want to say that I'm very happy to be here, and it's a real privilege to help present and celebrate this wonderful book. My presentation is entitled Titian's Materials, Techniques and Creative Process as Revealed by Titian and Save Venice, Conserving 6 Masterpieces, edited by Davide Gasparotto and Gabriele Matino. Now we can go on to the next slide. Thanks. Titian's techniques have been an object of fascination since his lifetime, and that has not abated in the centuries since. Artists in particular have been fascinated to try to know the secrets of perhaps the ultimate painter's painter. The most famous account from his lifetime comes from Giorgio Vasari, who published an account that really set up 2 canonical ideas for understanding Titian's technique. One, that there's 2 phases in his career, at least 2 phases, early and late. And second, that there's some deceptive ease in his approach. It seems easy, but it's very sophisticated. And so Vasari wrote, "It is quite true that his method in these later works is rather different from that of his youth. His early paintings are executed with a certain finesse and incredible diligence, and can be viewed from both close up and from afar. These recent works," he was talking about the later career, "on the other hand, are dashed off in bold strokes, broadly applied, in great patches, in such a manner that they cannot be looked at closely, but from a distance appear perfect. And this method has been the reason that many, wishing to imitate Titian and so demonstrate their own ability, have only produced clumsy pictures. This happens because they think that such paintings are done without effort, but such is not the case, and they delude themselves, for Titian's pictures are often repainted, gone over and retouched repeatedly, so the work involved is evident. Carried out in this way, the method is judicious, beautiful and magnificent, because the pictures seem to come alive and are executed with great skill, hiding the effort that went into them." Centuries later, in the words of Delacroix, writing in 1857, we see some similarities, this is desire to understand, and a feeling that he should be able to grasp something, but he kind of can't. So he said, "It is hard to say how a man like Titian set about his lay-in. The steps he took to arrive at such perfection remain a mystery. There still exist underpaintings from pictures by Titian, but I do not think that any of these underpaintings can give us the clue to the methods which Titian used in order to bring them to that always consistent style so remarkable in his finished works." And then not so long afterwards, from Renoir, we hear a bit of frustration. He said, "That old Titian, he even looks like me, and he is forever stealing my tricks." Next slide, please. So we have some advantages over Renoir and Delacroix in trying to understand the tricks or the technical processes of Titian. And first and foremost, among them are technical examination and conservation. This is done primarily to preserve artworks, and of course that's the first mission of Save Venice, but it has this wonderful side effect, certainly for us art historians, but I think anyone who's passionate about Titian, that they bring all this new information about Titian's creative processes. It's immensely valuable, and as Davide said, conservation produces knowledge. This book brings together the findings from technical study and conservation in an interdisciplinary dialogue with art history. And for me, the most fantastic thing about the book is that the discoveries published here are often, as the authors say in the introduction, surprising. They're frequently unexpected. And when you're dealing with an artist as well known and well studied as Titian, that's really the most exciting thing that can happen, to get a new piece of information that overturns your long held understanding. Next slide, please. I decided to just talk about 2 works here because for me there was just too much information. The book is too rich for me to discuss all the paintings, and I preferred to do a deep dive into 2 of the works. So I chose the Assunta and the Madonna di Capesaro that we've had been introduced to us by the previous speakers. These works were both produced for the Basilica of the Frari in Venice, which many of you may have visited. And they're really interesting because they're produced at a similar moment for the same building. Yet comparing them in depth in terms of technique shows the rapidity of his technical development. So he's really at the forefront of Venetian technical development, And this is a moment of fast change in Venetian materials and techniques anyway, and we'll see that as we go through. Next slide, please. So when Titian accepted the commission for a painting for the high altar of the Frari, he took on a series of technical challenges. Perhaps first and foremost among them is the scale of the enterprise. The painting itself is massive, 6.9 meters high, and it also has to visually ground and center this enormous basilica. He also faced the challenge of the counterlight, which is let's say, a problem with visibility. If any of you have taken photos of people with the light coming in behind them, you'll know the problem that causes. And that caused difficulties in the visibility of the painting. But as we can see, even more since the conservation, Titian more than met this challenge. And when you walk in to the Frari, the first thing that strikes you all the way back far away at the end of the church is Titian's Assunta, which hits your eyes in this incredible way from as soon as you come in. So how did he go about that in processual terms? Yeah, please, next slide. You're right, quite right. The foundation of the work in physical terms is a huge wooden panel. It's made of 20 planks of horizontally joined poplar wood. And it's interesting to think about Titian's use of panel here in relation to an art technical revolution that was happening precisely at this time in Venice. Between the late 15th century and mid-16th century, Venetian artists were increasingly painting on canvas instead of painting on wood or on variants of fresco on the wall. And the transition to canvas in Venice had an enormous influence on the development of the future of art. I mean, painting on canvas becomes the modern picture form par excellence. And this is largely to do thanks to Venetian painters and especially to Titian, who really becomes known as a painter mainly of oil on canvas because of his influence and creativity that really contributed to the development of canvas painting across Europe. But here, he's working on a more traditional support that is a panel altarpiece. Roberto Saccoman's conservation of the wooden support sheds light on why it's still in really excellent condition, despite the hundreds of years have passed since it was created, and it having been in an often very humid apse in the church. Among these details are the fact that it was made from a group of poplar trees, 5 or 6, carefully selected, and a system of vertical support beams that were on the back originally made of larch wood and helped to preserve the work. Next slide, please. So once the support was complete, it was prepared with 2 layers of gesso before it could be painted. And fascinatingly, material evidence brought to light by Giulio Bono indicates that it was painted in situ. This is a new discovery, and it really helps us understand how Titian was able to devise a composition that works so well with the architecture and space of the basilica. And it contributes to answering wider questions that we have about where Venetian artists were painting their works, which is not always well documented or obvious. Next slide, please. In terms of working out that composition, Titian indeed used a series of underdrawings. What I'm showing you on the PowerPoint is an infrared macrophotography image from the Assunta Restored website. So if you go to that website yourselves, you can kind of zoom in and see some of the infrared imaging that's bringing to light the different stages of underdrawing that Titian worked through. So Titian used at first a cartoon to trace a schematic image, then freehand brush drawing, and then freehand drawing in a drier medium. Seeing these images, bringing these images to light as part of a broader reevaluation of the question of Venetian drawing. So as Matthias alluded to, there was a long-standing myth that Venetian artists hardly drew and that they didn't do underdrawings beneath their paintings, and especially Titian, that he didn't do underdrawings. Well, these images are showing really that he did. And as Giulio Manieri-Elia puts it eloquently in the book, they're bringing to us a whole new corpus of Titian drawings seen through infrared work. Can you go on to the next slide, please? Thank you. I really enjoy the appendix to this book that has these fantastic schematic images that show some of the process of creation in some of the works. And this allows you to follow the different stages that Titian was kind of changing his mind as he worked on the Assunta. And if you look particularly at stage 2, you can relate that back to the image we just saw. You see that the Madonna at one stage had her arm out more straight and a more billowing Baroque robe, and then he amended that later. So that's just one of the examples of changes that were happening in underdrawing stage. Next slide, please. Thanks. So as he got to the painting stage, well, it may not surprise you to learn, I think you can tell just looking at the painting that it's painted with the highest quality pigments, finely ground. Venice was a hub for the international pigment trade. Artists traveled from afar to get the highest quality pigments from Venetian vendicolori, and Titian certainly had access to those pigments and used them here. But the surprising find for me from this publication, from these technical studies, is the fact that the medium here may be a combination of egg tempera and oil. This has always been written about as an oil on panel painting, but actually Titian may either have layered, so use egg tempera layers in the lower layer and then oil on top, or used an emulsion. And that's quite traditional. So if we're looking at an oil on wood panel, an egg tempera, that's a more traditional, older medium. These are kind of traditional methods. Next slide, please. Yet, at the same time, we also see a foreshadowing of the future of Titian's painting. In these details of the angels, in the putti, if you get up really close to the Assunta, as this the conservation treatment allowed, temporarily in a visit to the scaffolding, but the book records for all of us in these great detail images, you can see that he's already using a really painterly handling in these figures. Can you go on to the next slide, please? If you look at the face of God the Father, in the shadowy marks around his face, these are kind of strokes and broad brush strokes, or in the curls, in the hair, these are rapidly put down, fast paint marks. Next slide, please. And here in these, the faces of these putti, just made of light, basically. They're just a few strokes of cool yellow paint applied rapidly, and leaving the brushstrokes seen. So they're anticipating the kind of handling that Vasari attributes to the later part of Titian's career, but it's already here. So the Assunta is like the history and the future of Venetian painting in one artwork. It's incredible. Next slide, please. Now, I was asked to talk about Titian's creative process, so I focused on the painting itself rather than the frame. But just as I finish off on the Assunta, I would like to say that the conservation of the frame by Egidio Arlango has also helped us to see much better these monochrome putti in the spandrels, these angels. And as he wrote in the book, they are formally very consonant, very coherent with what we see in the Assunta itself. So I actually look forward very much to what future dialogues with art history this will prompt, what our historians will do with these angels. Okay, next slide, please. Now I'll talk about the Madonna di Capezero more briefly. There are essential similarities between these two paintings. Titian finished the Assunta, and then just the next year he started the Madonna di Capezero, which was painted over a much longer period. It has a complex and creative process. But there are significant differences that show the rapidity of Titian's technical development. So next slide, please. This is oil on canvas painting. So the support is canvas and the medium is oil. This is the more modern technique that's going to become the dominant form of the European picture par excellence for the next 300, 400 years, the oil on canvas painting. Next slide, please. And it's compositionally highly innovative. This composition went on to have a huge impact on subsequent altarpieces. It's the first Sacra Conversazione with the Holy Group off center, and that charges the image with a renewed vitality. And there are also these two huge columns that are so ahead of their time that art historians long believed them to be a Baroque addition. Now, we can come to a deeper understanding of how Titian arrived at such an original invention by following, practically step by step, thanks to the book, how he got here. Next slide, please. Yeah. Titian always intended an off-center figure grouping, and if any of you have visited the Frari, which I'm sure many of you have, you can see that this makes sense because it's a side altar, so the oblique angle composition is very inviting as you walk in there. But he worked and reworked the architectural setting. Next slide, please. Again, I've gone to the appendix. You can see I really like these schematic images. You can see that here, the different stages of architecture that Titian tried out. So he tried an arch, he tried a horizontal entablature, and he also then tried out different versions of the columns. And his final composition was radical. These massive columns that extend, they're similar to those in the Basilica, but they extend into eternity in the sky. And it's just captivating to be able to trace the stages of experimentation that resulted in such a novel, such a revolutionary image. And it contributes to solving a mystery and a debate that has been there among art historians since the 19th century, when artist Adolf Wolff first noticed a visual evidence of different architectural setting in the background. And I do want to note that David Rosand got quite close to understanding the stages that Titian worked through on the basis really of his own examination, deep knowledge of Titian, and a 1976 X-ray. So it's quite impressive that now the results of technical examination are confirming a lot of what he was able to figure out. Next slide, please. So to finish up, I would say that to my mind, the most wonderful thing about the revelations of these technical studies and conservation treatments, put together so beautifully in this book, is the insight that they give us into the creative processes of long ago. We can't get quite as close to the paintings as the conservators do, and certainly not for as long as they spend with them, but through them we gain something like the next closest proximity. Next slide, please. If I'm permitted to indulge a flight of fancy and one last close-up, I would say that with this we get almost as near as we can to standing there with Titian, working in his studio, or as in the case of the Assunta, in situ in the Basilica. We are getting close to that position that Frederick mentioned, David Rosand always wanted us to be in, which is arm's length plus a brush away from Titian's paintings. And so I want to thank you, Save Venice, everyone who worked on this book, the conservators, the people who did the technical examination, and of course Davide and Gabriele for editing this wonderful volume. Thank you.
Material to cover. I was just fascinated. I mean, each paragraph by both of you seemed to be referring to whole pages of more information about this artist who continues to surprise us. So what you're seeing right now on the screen, all our Save Venice viewers, just a list of all the Titian conservation treatments done, going way back to 1978, which is quite something. And then, these earlier things were done by the organization's founders. Some of the same names come up again and again, and it shows just really how beloved this artist is. And you can see then the real new pace starts in about 2010 with a number of major conservation treatments, including ones undergoing or underway right now, which is also terribly exciting. This commitment to a single artist is something that's special, that is very special to Save Venice. Carpaccio, now Giulia Lama, Tintoretto, Veronese. We've done so much of this. So thank you to our panelists. A couple quick questions. You can put them in the Q&A if you'd like. But one question, I guess this would be for Davide. We've heard a supporter in Chicago wants to know how much familiarity did Titian have with Pontormo, say his famous Visitation or other paintings from that period?
I mean, as you heard from Matthias, there was definitely an awareness in Titian of development of Central Italian painting, especially what was happening in Rome with Raphael and Michelangelo. We don't know, maybe through drawings that were brought up to Venice, sometimes prints. I'm convinced that at least Titian knew very well the artistic development in the Pianura Padana, in northern Italy. I'm convinced he might have gone to Piacenza to see the Madonna Sistina by Raphael before painting the Assunta. It seems that, I mean, his palette and his way of painting is way different from Pontormo. So maybe I would say more looking to Raphael and Michelangelo than directly to Pontormo, although even Pontormo was looking at Michelangelo a lot. But definitely it's important to stress what Matthias stressed very well, that there was an awareness of contemporary development. Titian was not working in isolation in Venice, unaware of what was going on novelties that were developing in other areas in Italy.
So there, I think very good answer there, Davide. We have a question about ordering the book. It's not out yet. It hasn't even been printed, but we will make sure that it is announced in a number of different venues or ways with Save Venice, that how the book can be purchased. It will be very beautiful. Having spent a lot of time with the proofs, it's gorgeous. The design is particularly attractive. The photographs, many of which you've seen here, all new photography, are just superb. Any questions that our panelists have for each other about about conservation discoveries, about Titian's development as laid out by Matthias, for example.
I have a question for Matthias, actually.
Sure.
If I could join. I'm really interested in what you were saying about Titian as a fresco painter and his fresco work being really critical for understanding his approach to painting, particularly the broad handling. And I really see what you're talking about and would agree. And then on the other hand, when I'm looking at the Santo frescoes, they're such an unusual palette for fresco painting, or is that just me having a central Italian idea of fresco that there looks like, I mean, I suppose it's just forward and back. It looks like we have somehow the colors of oil painting and the gesture of fresco. I would love to hear more about that from you.
I think that's right. I think it is a Venetian approach to fresco that we know less well because most of what we have from Venice is just so badly conserved. If you look at Sebastiano's frescoes in the Farnesina, they're also very unusual in color when you look at them closely. Like his Polyphemus has that dissolving sensation of like, there's a sunset there, you know, like it's a similar thing. So I think they just have a different fresco technique, and it's lost to time because most of it's destroyed and is such bad condition. So it's not, we understand fresco very much from the way that they would do it in central Italy, and it's not that necessarily. I think it's important to keep in mind. So yeah, I think that's what it is.
And if I can add something, a little observation is that I think northern Italian frescoes, think to Dosso Dossi in the Castello del Buon Consiglio or Romanino in Pisogne, they have this very painterly quality, which is closer in some way to what we think about oil, with an extremely confident fresco technique, but with a type of palette and way of finishing the figures, which is very different, I think, from Florence and Rome. It's in some ways painterly. It's more painterly.
Yeah. Thank you. That's really interesting.
I have a question about the underdrawing in the Assunta. So I also love those diagrams, but I find them a little hard to figure out what of it is it all underdrawing that they're representing, or is it also representing earlier stages of the painting? So from reading the account and from having heard Julia talk about it, I think there are cartoon transfers here, or some kind of transfer. Like some of it is mechanical, some of it's transferred from drawing in some way onto the panel. It is confounding to me how the central figure is so full of like alternative solutions, including very rough ones suggested differently, where everything else seems more or less. There are other instances, seems to follow some kind of layout that is more mechanical. I don't know whether you can address that. Like what is the sense of what parts are transferred and what parts are improvised with the brush, drawing with the brush?
I don't know if Davide or Gabriele want to talk about that. I understood that from the schematic diagrams that they're initially the drawing phase, but then they also involve some of the later painting stage. But you answer because you knew better.
No, you actually following the actual idea that Bono got over it is quite complicated, as you can tell, because there are different layers of it with different media, and it is. I mean, I had the same impressions as Matthias when I saw a lot of work and effort around the figure of the Virgin, which then you wouldn't expect, since when you see it there is really all there very pleasantly presented. So it is, I think, a starting point now with the material that we presented to study more probably and have different approach to the painting to try to figure out. The problem with Titian, as we know, that we don't really have too many drawings, although we have some. And what this new technology as infrared and X-ray does is to provide a new corpus of drawing in a way that can be studied and analyzed. What always struck me, this is going a little bit apart from the question, what always struck me of the Assunta following the conservation treatment is how you see death and is something that is, before we tend to think about it in terms of the construction of the picture as a circle and a square. Now I think it's the three-dimensionality that adds more to that painting. The Virgin is ascending, but is also walking toward the congregation, welcoming the congregation in a way. So again, another way of looking at the painting now that we can study with, using different evidence.
Okay,
So
fabulous.
just quickly, follow up.
Very quick, Matthias.
Yeah. Is the Virgin, is she also underdrawn mechanically, or is it just this wild flurry of lines, or is there also a mechanical underdrawing under that?
It looked like from the book and from what I understood from Giulio, there was also a cartoon tracing with the Madonna under, and then he reworks it. And I think something Giulio really emphasizes is a reworking towards simplification.
Yeah.
It's less kind of constant.
It's very difficult to detect technically the transfer. So it's very difficult. We know there were definitely cartoons but up to scale drawings, but it's very difficult to detect the transfer, while we detect a lot the changes that he was doing while he was proceeding. But obviously, like there was drawing studies for individual figures. In the case of the Assunta for St. Peter, there is this famous drawing. We can think of a system of transfer, but it's not really clearly detectable with the investigations.
Okay, we've had some, thank you. We've got some great questions. Anyone who's put a question in the Q&A, you will get a response. We've got good ones and observations as well. We'll follow up with that. I want to thank our panelists, and so wonderful job, all of you, Davide, Matthias, Gabriele, Cleo, and of course the people in the St. Venice office who are doing a tremendous job on this. Lots of attendees. Very pleased to see that we were as high as the mid-80s in attendees. And I want to thank all of our supporters. We got one more slide, I think. And this is just a little pitch that if you've been moved by all the exciting things that have been discovered and how we're learning about this artist in new ways, and his how plugged in he was to other centers of Italian art, how much he changed his technique, all these new assumptions of being overturned about how he approached a work of art. Think about becoming a member of St. Venice. If you're not, most of you probably are, but you can support an entire restoration. You can sponsor something yourself. We have sponsorship opportunities, and we have a wait list even, because some projects are so exciting. Several people have signed up already. But Kimberly is our director of development. She's Kim at St. Venice, or you can call our office if you'd like to be part of it. I have to say, one of my favorite things in St. Venice is to be a sponsor on a specific project. Done that a number of times, and I just love it. So we have our website is very much up to date, and remember, the scholarly portion of our website gets better and better, including we have a special Titian website devoted to the Assunta, and that's something you would really enjoy spending a little time with, where many of these new images are available. Thanks to all of you, and grazie mille a tutti. Good day. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Arrivederci.